Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, welcome to Eclipsed Histories, where we don't just scratch the surface, we dig all the way down to the bones. Before we get started on today's massive deep dive, I have a quick question for you. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments below. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And while you're down there, if you appreciate these long-form documentaries and want to help keep the lights on in this dark corner of YouTube, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It really does make a huge difference. Now, get comfortable, grab a warm drink and maybe an extra blanket. Because where we are going today, the sun doesn't rise for months at a time, and the cold is enough to snap iron in half. Let's step into the ice. Chapter 1. The Frozen Grail. To understand why 129 men would willingly sail into a frozen hell from which there was likely no return, we first have to understand the map. If you look at a map of the world today, the Canadian Arctic archipelago looks like a shattered puzzle. It is a chaotic jumble of islands, straits, and inlets. We know exactly where the land ends and the water begins. We have satellites that track the ice drift in real time. But if you were to look at a map in the Admiralty offices of London in the early 19th century, that entire region was a terrifying blank space. It was a white void. For nearly 400 years, that white void had haunted the European imagination. It was known as the Northwest Passage. Ideally, it was a theoretical shipping route that would connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean over the top of North America. If it existed, it would change the world economy overnight. It would allow British merchant ships to sail to the riches of China and India without having to go the long way around Africa or the dangerous route around South America. It was the greatest shortcut on Earth, but it was more than just a trade route. It was a philosophical obsession. To the Victorian British mind, the world was a machine that could be understood, categorized, and conquered. They had mapped the dark jungles of Africa. They had charted the coasts of Australia, and they had navigated the great oceans. The idea that there was a massive chunk of the planet that defied them, that refused to be mapped, was unacceptable. It was an affront to their pride. The Northwest Passage became the holy grail of exploration, and like the holy grail, it demanded blood. The history of the passage is a history of abject failure. It didn't start with Franklin. It started centuries earlier, in the days of Queen Elizabeth I. Men like Martin Frobisher and Henry Hudson sailed into the ice with high hopes, only to be beaten back by the ferocity of the Arctic. Hudson, famous for discovering the bay that bears his name, met a particularly grim end. After a winter trapped in the ice in 1611, his starving crew mutinied. They cast Hudson, his teenage son, and 7 loyal men adrift in a small open boat in the middle of the bay. They were never seen again. That should have been a warning. The Arctic does not care about your rank, your charts, or your ambition. But the British Navy was stubborn. By the time the 19th century rolled around, the search had intensified. Following the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had a massive navy with nothing to do. They had hundreds of ships and thousands of officers who were bored and hungry for glory. The Admiralty, led by the legendary Sir John Barrow, decided to pivot the entire might of the Royal Navy toward polar exploration. Barrow was a man who ruled from behind a mahogany desk in London. He had never seen the pack ice, yet he was convinced, absolutely convinced, that the Arctic Ocean was an open polar sea. He believed that once you punched through the ring of ice at the exterior, you would find a warm, navigable ocean surrounding the North Pole. It sounds insane to us today, but this was the prevailing scientific theory of the time. It was this theory that sent ship after ship into the teeth of the freeze. By 1845, the puzzle was almost complete. There was just a small section, less than 500 kilometers of unexplored water, that needed to be charted to link the known eastern discoveries with the known western discoveries. If they could just sail a straight line through that final gap, the map would be finished. The passage would be conquered. The British flag would fly over the roof of the world. It looked so easy on paper, just a straight line. But paper maps don't show the temperature plunging to minus 50 degrees. They don't show the wind that feels like a razor blade against exposed skin. And they certainly don't show the ice. The ice of the Canadian Arctic is not like the ice on a pond. It is a living, moving geological force. It is driven by currents and winds, stacking up into pressure ridges that are 20 or 30 feet high. It is hard as granite. When the wind blows, millions of tons of ice begin to move. If a ship is caught between two floes, the pressure is infinite. Oak beams the size of tree trunks snap like matchsticks. Iron bolts shear off like buttons. The men in London knew this was dangerous, but they also believed they had solved the problem. They were living in the Industrial Revolution. They had steam power. They had canned food. They had the belief that British technology could overcome any obstacle of nature. They were wrong. The Admiralty needed a man to lead this final crowning expedition. They had a list of candidates, but for various reasons, the top choices were unavailable or uninterested. James Clark Ross, the greatest polar explorer alive, had promised his new wife he would stop sailing into the unknown. Other captains were deemed too abrasive or of the wrong social standing. So, the finger of fate pointed to Sir John Franklin. Franklin was 59 years old. In the Navy of that era, that was ancient for a field commander. He was not a young, dashing hero. He was overweight. He suffered from poor circulation, which made him terribly sensitive to the cold, and he had been ashore for years, serving as the governor of Van Diemen's Land. He was a man looking for one last triumph to cap off his career. He didn't want to fade away in a retirement home. He wanted to go out as a knight of the realm who finished the job. But Franklin had a nickname in the Navy, a nickname that, in hindsight, feels like a dark omen. They called him the man who ate his boots. Years earlier, in 1819, Franklin had led an overland expedition in Canada to map the Coppermine River. It was a disaster of biblical proportions. The logistics failed, the guides deserted, and the food ran out completely. Franklin and his men were forced to trek across the barren tundra, starving to death. It became a march of horror. They survived by eating lichen scraped off rocks known as tripe de roche, which caused severe bowel agony, and eventually by boiling down the leather of their own spare boots to drink the broth. 11 of his 20 men died on that trip. But the deaths weren't just from starvation. There were rumors, dark rumors, that shadowed Franklin for the rest of his life. One of the voyageurs was suspected of murdering the weaker officers one by one and feeding their bodies to the survivors. Franklin had survived, barely. He returned to England a hero because the British public loved a survivor. They loved a man who could endure suffering with a stiff upper lip. But the Coppermine expedition proved one thing. Franklin was brave, but he was not a brilliant strategist. He was prone to trusting bad information. He was prone to pushing on when he should have turned back. Now, decades later, the Admiralty was handing him the keys to the most expensive, most technologically advanced expedition in history. They were giving him 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They were giving him 129 picked men. They were giving him enough food to last for 3 years, maybe 5 if they rationed. They were sending the man who ate his boots back to the place that had almost killed him. And this time, he wouldn't just be risking his own life. He would be carrying the lives of an entire generation of sailors with him. The vessels chosen for this task were not sleek, speedy frigates. Erebus and Terror were bomb vessels. They had been built for war, specifically for shelling coastal fortifications. They were designed to withstand the immense recoil of massive mortars firing from their decks. Because of this, their hulls were incredibly thick and their frames were heavily reinforced. They were slow, tubby, and ugly, but they were built like tanks. But wood and iron were not enough for this modern age. The ships were taken into dry dock and retrofitted with the cutting edge of Victorian technology, steam power. They took surplus locomotive engines from the London and Greenwich Railway and installed them deep in the bellies of the wooden ships. This was revolutionary. Previous explorers had been at the mercy of the wind. Franklin would have power. He could fire up the boilers, turn the screw propeller, and punch his way through the pack ice at 4 knots. To feed these engines, they loaded tons of coal. To keep the men warm, they installed a complex hot water heating system that ran through pipes in the officers' cabins and the crew's quarters. It was designed to keep the interior of the ship at a comfortable temperature, even when the air outside was cold enough to freeze mercury. They packed libraries with thousands of books. They packed musical instruments. They packed school supplies to teach the illiterate sailors how to read and write during the long winter nights. It was designed to be a floating microcosm of British civilization, a bubble of warmth and culture that would simply float through the savage wilderness, untouched and unharmed. But an army marches on its stomach, and an expedition survives on its pantry. The provisioning of the Franklin expedition was a monumental task. They needed to feed 129 men for at least 3 years. In previous centuries, scurvy was the great killer of sailors, but by 1845, the Navy believed they had solved scurvy with lemon juice. The real challenge was calories. They loaded thousands of pounds of salt beef, pork, flour, and biscuits. But the centerpiece of their survival strategy was, again, a new technology: tinned food. Canning was a relatively new invention. The idea that you could seal fresh meat and vegetables in a metal tin and have it remain edible for years was seen as a miracle. It meant the men wouldn't have to rely solely on salted, cured meats. They could have roast beef, mutton, and vegetable soup in the middle of the Arctic winter. The Admiralty put out a contract for 8,000 tins of preserved food. It was a massive order, and, as is so often the case with government contracts, it went to the lowest bidder. A man named Stefan Goldner won the contract. Goldner had a factory in Romania, and he promised he could deliver the goods cheaper and faster than anyone else. But the timeline was impossible. Goldner had only a few months to slaughter, cook, and can thousands of pounds of meat. In his factory, speed became the only metric that mattered. The meat was often barely cooked before being shoved into the canisters, but the real danger wasn't the meat itself. It was the tins. The cans were sealed with lead solder. The workers, rushing to meet the deadline, were sloppy. They applied the solder thick and fast. It dripped down the inside of the seams. It pooled in the bottom of the cans, mixing with the gravy and the soup. Lard is a neurotoxin. It is insidious. It doesn't kill you immediately. It builds up in your system, slowly attacking the brain and the nervous system. It causes confusion, paranoia, aggression, and fatigue. The Admiralty didn't know this. Franklin didn't know this. As the crates were hoisted into the holds of the Erebus and Terror, the crew cheered. They thought they were loading the finest provisions the Empire could provide. In reality, they were loading thousands of time bombs. This tragedy was written before the ships even left the dock. It was written in the hubris of the planning. It was written in the budget cuts of the food supply. And it was written in the choice of the men. While Franklin was the figurehead, the real backbone of the expedition lay in his subordinates. The captain of the HMS Terror was Francis Crozier. Crozier was an Irishman, and in the snobbish hierarchy of the Royal Navy, that mattered. Despite being arguably the most experienced polar explorer on the entire expedition, he had sailed to both the Arctic and Antarctic with James Clark Ross. He was constantly overlooked for promotion. He was moody, depressive, and heartbroken. Crozier was the only man in the leadership team who truly understood the danger. He didn't share the blind optimism of the others. He knew that the ice didn't care about steam engines. Then there was Commander James Fitzjames, the captain of the Erebus. He was the opposite of Crozier: young, handsome, charismatic, and a master of self-promotion. He was a war hero, but he had zero polar experience. For Fitzjames, this trip was a lark. It was an adventure. He represented the new confident face of the Navy. The dynamic was set: an aging, overly optimistic commander, a depressive, cynical expert who was ignored, and a dashing, inexperienced glory hound. It was a recipe for command failure, waiting for the pressure of the ice to crack it open. As the Erebus and Terror slipped their moorings at Greenhithe in May 1845, the mood was electric. Lady Jane Franklin was there to see her husband off, convinced he would return a hero. The ships were so heavy with supplies, they sat low in the water. They sailed north, stopping briefly in the Orkney Islands, and then pushed on toward Greenland to pick up final supplies and discharge the transport ships. In late July 1845, they were spotted by two whaling ships, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, in Baffin Bay. The whalers were waiting for the ice to clear so they could hunt. The captains hailed Franklin's ships. They were invited aboard the Erebus. They reported that the crew was in high spirits. Franklin was confident. They had plenty of supplies. They were ready to make history. The whalers watched the two ships sail westward, their black hulls cutting a sharp contrast against the blinding white of the ice. They watched until the masts of Erebus and Terror dipped below the horizon, moving into Lancaster Sound. And that was it. That was the last time any European eyes would see Sir John Franklin or his men alive. They sailed into the white void on the map, and the void swallowed them whole. The greatest expedition in history had simply vanished. Chapter 2. The Long Night. When the Erebus and Terror vanished from the sight of the whalers in Baffin Bay, they didn't sail off the edge of the world. They sailed into a deceptive calm. The summer of 1845 was relatively kind to them at first. They pushed into Lancaster Sound, the massive gateway to the archipelago. The water was open. The steam engines were humming. For the first few weeks, it must have felt like the Admiralty was right. The maps were wrong, and the way was clear. But the Arctic has a way of luring you in before it slams the door shut. As the days shortened in August and September, the temperature began to plummet. The water, which had been fluid and navigable, started to thicken. It turns into something sailors call grease ice, a slushy, viscous layer that kills the momentum of a ship. Then comes the pancake ice, floating disks that harden and collide. Finally, the floes knit together into a solid white sheet. By the time they reached a small hook spit of land called Beachy Island, the door had closed. The winter ice had formed. They were going nowhere until next summer. Standard procedure for a polar expedition was to winter over. This wasn't a surprise. They had planned for it. The crews of both ships worked together to cut a canal through the ice, sawing through the frozen crust to guide the Erebus and Terror into a sheltered bay. Once the ships were locked in position, the ice froze around them, holding them in a vice-like grip. They dismantled the upper rigging to keep it from snapping in the gales. They built walls of snow around the decks to insulate the hulls. And then the sun went down. For 3 months, the sun does not rise in the high Arctic. It is a period of perpetual twilight and total darkness. This is the psychological breaking point for most men. The darkness messes with your circadian rhythms. It triggers depression. It alters your perception of time. But Franklin was ready for this. He was determined to keep morale high. He knew that idleness was the enemy. If the men had time to think about the freezing void outside, they would go mad. So, the Erebus and Terror became the strangest places on Earth. Inside the ships, the steam heating systems kept the lower decks at a toasty temperature. While the wind howled outside at -40 degrees, inside, the officers were sitting in their shirt sleeves, drinking wine and reading from the extensive library. They turned the ships into a theatre. They literally built a stage on the deck, draped in canvas to keep out the wind. They put on plays. Captains Crozier and Fitzjames participated in pantomimes. They dressed up in costumes, women's dresses made from spare calico, fake wigs made from oakum. The sailors laughed and cheered. They held masquerade balls on the ice. They set up a school to teach the illiterate deckhands how to read. It was a surreal projection of Victorian London society, transported to the most desolate place on the planet. But beneath the laughter and the theatrical makeup, something was wrong. The heating system, while warm, was flawed. It relied on a series of pipes to circulate hot water, but it didn't ventilate well. The ships became damp. Condensation dripped from the beams. The air was thick and heavy, and in that damp, warm petri dish of a ship, bacteria began to thrive. The food, too, was becoming an issue faster than anyone expected. The men were eating the tinned meat from Goldner's factory. It tasted metallic. Some of the tins were already bulging, a sign of botulism or putrefaction, and had to be thrown onto the ice. But most of them were eaten, and with every meal, the invisible lead levels in the men's bloodstreams were ticking up. Lead poisoning is a ghost. You don't feel it happen. At first it's just a headache. Then, maybe your stomach hurts. You feel tired, lethargic. You get irritable. Your gums might turn a strange shade of blue. In the close quarters of the winter camp, these symptoms were easily dismissed as the winter blues or the effects of the dark. But then, the dying started. It wasn't the old men who fell first. It wasn't the officers under the high stress of command. It was the young men. On New Year's Day, 1846, John Torrington, a stoker, died. He was 20 years old. A stoker's job was to shovel coal into the furnaces, hard, dirty, physical labor. He should have been one of the toughest men on the ship, but he withered away. The ship's surgeon recorded consumption, tuberculosis, as the cause of death, but tuberculosis usually takes years to kill. Torrington went down fast. They carried his body out of the warm ship and into the stinging cold. Burial in the Arctic is an industrial operation. The ground is permafrost. It is frozen solid as rock for hundreds of feet down. You cannot dig a grave with a shovel. You have to chip it out with pickaxes and crowbars. It took hours of back-breaking labor to hack a shallow rectangular pit into the gravel of Beechy Island. They wrapped Torrington in a simple cloth shroud. They placed him in a coffin, and then, in a moment of tenderness that echoes across history, they placed a small pillow of wood shavings under his head. They lowered him into the freeze, covered him up, and left a wooden headboard to mark his place. 3 days later, John Hartnell died. He was 25, same symptoms, coughing, wasting away, delirium. They hacked another hole in the ice. Then, in April, William Braine died. He was 32, 3 graves in a row on a desolate, windswept beach. When modern anthropologists exhumed these bodies in the 1980s, they found something terrifying. Because of the permafrost, the men were not skeletons. They were perfectly preserved mummies. When they opened the coffins, John Torrington looked like he was sleeping. His eyes were half open, blue and cloudy. His skin was intact. He still had a fabric strip tied around his jaw to keep his mouth closed, but the autopsies revealed the truth. These men were riddled with tuberculosis, yes, but they also had skyrocketing levels of lead in their hair and bones. Torrington weighed less than 90 pounds when he died. He had wasted away from the inside out. The pneumonia killed him, but the lead had opened the door. These 3 graves were the first red flags. 3 young, healthy men dead within the first year of a 3-year mission. It spooked the crew. You can imagine the whispers in the mess hall. Why them? Who is next? Is the ship cursed? But the officers kept the stiff upper lip. Franklin, ever the optimist, likely framed it as bad luck. Just a few weak constitutions weeding themselves out. The spring was coming. The sun was returning. The ice would break, and they would leave this place of death behind. When the summer of 1846 finally arrived, the ice cracked. The Erebus and Terror fired up their steam engines and broke free of Beechy Island. They left the 3 lonely wooden headboards behind as the only evidence they had ever been there. They didn't leave any letters. This is one of the great mysteries of the expedition. It was standard procedure to leave a cairn, a pile of rocks, with a metal cylinder inside containing a message, at your winter camp. It was a message for future explorers. We were here. We are all fine. We are going that way. Searchers scoured Beechy Island for years. They found the graves. They found piles of empty tin cans, hundreds of them, tested later to show terrible soldering. They found the remains of a garden the men had tried to grow. They found a pair of gloves laid out on a rock to dry, weighted down with pebbles, as if the owner intended to come back for them in 5 minutes. But they found no message, no written record. Why? Did Franklin forget? That seems impossible for a Royal Navy commander. Did they write one and it got lost? Or, and this is the darker theory, were things already so chaotic, so confusing, and so morale broken by the sudden deaths and the rush to leave the ice, that they simply neglected the most basic rule of exploration? They sailed out of Beechy Island and turned south, down a waterway called Peel Sound. It looked like open water. It looked like the path to victory. If they followed it south, They would skirt the edge of King William Island and potentially hit the American coast. They would be through, but they were sailing into a trap. The ice in Peel Sound is not local ice. It is old ice, thick, multi-year ice that flows down from the high Arctic and gets funneled into that strait like a clogged drain. By heading south, Franklin wasn't finding a shortcut. He was driving his ships into a funnel that was slowly, inexorably squeezing shut. September 1846. The temperature dropped again. The new ice formed, bonding with the old ice. The trap snapped. The Erebus and Terror were beset, frozen in. But this time, they weren't in a protected bay like Beechey Island. They were in the middle of the open pack, northwest of King William Island. They were exposed to the full fury of the winds and the crushing pressure of the drifting floes. They prepared for their second winter. They put up the canvas covers. They got the theatre ready again. But the mood had shifted. The novelty was gone. The 3 graves at Beechey haunted them. The tinned food was running lower, and more of it was spoiling. The lead was accumulating in their brains. And this time, the ice didn't just hold them. It began to drift. It carried the ships, locked in its grip, slowly, agonizingly, nowhere. They were passengers on a glacier, drifting imperceptibly south, deeper into the maze, further from rescue. The second long night began, and in the darkness of 1847, the real horror would begin to take shape. The silence of the Arctic was about to be broken by the sound of men losing their minds. Chapter 3. The White Room. If the first winter at Beechey Island was a tragedy, the second winter off King William Island was a slow-motion nightmare. You have to understand the geography to understand the doom. When the Erebus and Terror became trapped in September 1846, they weren't just stuck in a frozen lake. They were pinned in a massive, slow-moving conveyor belt of ice known as the McClintock Channel. This area is a bottleneck. The polar pack ice, chunks of ice the size of cathedrals, some of them 5 years old and harder than concrete, flows south from the Arctic Ocean and smashes into the northwest coast of King William Island. It piles up, it crushes, and it never, ever melts. Franklin didn't know this. His maps were blank. He thought he was sailing along the coast of a continent, but he was actually sailing into a cul-de-sac. When the ice seized the ships, it lifted them up. The Erebus and Terror, weighing hundreds of tons, were squeezed so hard that their heavy oak timbers groaned and popped like gunfire. The ships were listed over at awkward angles. The floors were no longer flat. For the next year, the men would live their lives on a tilt. The sun vanished again in November 1846. The darkness returned, but this time, the theatre and the masquerade balls felt different. The novelty of the Arctic had worn off. The men were now entering their 18th month of isolation. The ships, designed to be warm, dry sanctuaries, began to turn against them. The steam heating system, which sounded so brilliant in London, became a curse. To keep the heat in, the crews shoveled snow over the decks, insulating the ships like igloos. But inside, the lack of ventilation meant that the humidity had nowhere to go. It rained inside the ships. Condensation dripped from the ceiling beams. It soaked the sailors' hammocks. It saturated their wool clothes. The bedclothes froze to the walls of the hull. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, coal, smoke, and mould. The unsinkable machines had become damp, dark dungeons, and in this damp darkness, the invisible killers began to work. We talk a lot about lead poisoning in this story, and for good reason, but we have to understand what it actually does to a human being. It's not just a stomachache. Lead is a neurotoxin that mimics calcium. The body, starving for nutrients, absorbs the lead and deposits it into the bones and the brain. By the winter of 1846, the men had been eating the tinned food for over a year. The lead levels in their blood were approaching toxicity. The officers, who ate the most tinned food because it was considered a luxury, were hit the hardest. The symptoms are subtle at first. It starts with lead colic, crippling abdominal cramps that make a grown man curl up in the fetal position. Then comes the lead palsy, a weakness in the wrists and ankles. Men dropped their tools. They couldn't grip the ropes, but the worst effect is on the mind. Paranoia, depression, aggression. The diaries and journals from this time are lost, but we can imagine the atmosphere. The easy camaraderie of the first year evaporated. Small disagreements turned into feuds. The silence of the Arctic outside was replaced by the sound of whispering inside. The men became lethargic. They stopped washing. They stopped caring. The stiff upper lip of the Royal Navy was dissolving into a toxic stupor. And then the old enemy returned, scurvy. The Navy thought they had beaten scurvy with lemon juice. But there was a problem. The lemon juice provided to Franklin was cheap. It had been boiled to preserve it, which destroyed most of the vitamin C. After 2 years, what little potency it had was gone. Scurvy is a horrific way to die. It is essentially the disintegration of the body. Your collagen stops functioning. Your gums swell and turn black, covering your teeth. Old wounds, cuts you got 10 years ago, suddenly break open and start bleeding again. Broken bones that healed years ago snap apart. It is a disease of unmaking. By early 1847, the sick bays were filling up. The ship's surgeons, who were also suffering from lead poisoning, were helpless. They dispensed useless lemon juice and ineffective salves, while the men withered away. But amidst this physical decay, there was a struggle for command. Sir John Franklin was failing. He was 60 years old now. The stress of the entrapment, combined with the harsh conditions, was breaking him. He was the optimist, the man who believed God would provide a path. But God was silent, and the path was white. Francis Crozier, on the Terror, was watching the disaster unfold with a grim sense of validation. He had warned them. He knew the ice. Crozier was likely the only man who realized that they weren't just stuck for the winter, they were stuck forever. He argued that they should abandon the ships now, while the men still had some strength, and walk out, but abandoning His Majesty's ships was unthinkable to Franklin. It was mutiny against logic. They had engines, they had food, they just needed to wait for the summer of 1847. The ice would melt, the leads would open, and they would sail through to the Pacific. So they waited. They sat in the dark, bleeding and confused, waiting for a summer that would never come. In May 1847, with the sun finally returning, Franklin made a move. He sent out a small party led by Lieutenant Graham Gore. Their mission was to trek to King William Island and leave a message. This is the first tangible proof we have of their mindset. Gore and his men sledged to the shore. They built a cairn. They left a standard Admiralty form, rolled up in a metal cylinder. The message was dated May 28, 1847. It is a chilling document because of how delusional it is. It gives the coordinates of the ships. It lists the wintering at Beechy Island, though it gets the dates wrong, a sign of their confusion. And it ends with 2 words that stand in stark contrast to the reality of the dying men in the sick bay. All well, all well. They were trapped in the ice, poisoned, rotting from scurvy, and drifting aimlessly. But Lieutenant Gore, following the orders of his optimist commander, wrote, "All well." It was a lie, or perhaps it was a prayer. Gore returned to the ships in June, expecting to find the ice breaking up. He expected to hear the roar of the steam engines firing up. He expected to see open water. Instead, he found silence. The summer of 1847 was a non-summer. The temperature barely rose above freezing. The ice didn't crack. It didn't melt. It didn't move. The Erebus and Terror were still locked tight, fused into the floe, and then, on June 11, 1847, the final blow struck. Sir John Franklin died. We don't know exactly how. The records are gone. It could have been a heart attack brought on by the stress. It could have been pneumonia. It could have been the lead. But the timing suggests something more tragic, a broken heart. He died realizing that his luck had finally run out. He died knowing that he had led 128 men into a tomb. The death of the commander shattered the expedition. Franklin was the glue. He was the father figure. With him gone, the chain of command shifted to Captain Crozier. Crozier was now in charge of 2 frozen ships, a dying crew, and a summer that refused to arrive. He was an Irishman in a navy that looked down on him, commanding a fleet of ghosts. He looked at the ice, and he looked at the all-well note that Gore had just brought back, or perhaps was about to deposit, and he knew. There would be no sailing out of this. The engines were useless iron weights. The food was poison. The ships were coffins. Chapter 4. The Kingdom of Ice. When Sir John Franklin died on June 11, 1847, the soul of the expedition died with him. He was buried, likely through a hole in the ice near the ships, though his grave has never been found. The ceremony would have been brief. The men standing on the shifting floes, their breath steaming in the cold air, listening to the crack of the ice echoing the prayers for the dead. With the old lion gone, command fell to Captain Francis Crozier, and for the first time in 2 years, the expedition had a leader who saw the world as it actually was, not how he wished it to be. Crozier looked at the calendar. It was midsummer 1847. By all the rules of the Arctic, the ice should have been breaking up. The Erebus and Terror should have been shaking free, their steam engines thumping, ready to push through the final few hundred miles to the Bering Strait. But the ice was not moving. The summer temperatures hovered stubbornly around freezing. The leads, the cracks of open water, did not appear. The stark, terrifying reality settled over Crozier. We are not leaving this year. This meant a third winter. You have to understand what a third winter meant to men of the Victorian Navy. It was a death sentence. Their supplies were calculated for 3 years, but barely. The lemon juice was useless. The coal was nearly gone. The tinned food was turning more men into invalids every day. And psychologically, the crew was shattered. They had watched their beloved commander die. They had watched the seasons cycle without release. They were now prisoners. The winter of 1847 to 1848 was the descent into hell. The theatre shows stopped. The masquerade balls ended. There was no energy left for games. The men huddled in the bowels of the ships, conserving body heat. The condensation froze on the walls, turning the living quarters into ice caves. The discipline of the Royal Navy began to fray. In the close quarters, the sound of a man coughing, the wet, rattling cough of tuberculosis or pneumonia, became the soundtrack of their lives. Scurvy began to take the officers. This is unusual. Typically, officers eat better than the men. But on the Erebus and Terror, the officers were eating more of the tinned delicacies, the soups, the potted meats, which meant they were ingesting more lead. By the spring of 1848, the death toll was staggering. 9 officers were dead, 15 seamen were dead. That is an attrition rate that signals a total collapse of command structure. A ship cannot function when its brain is dying. Crozier made the only decision left to him. It was a decision that went against every instinct of a naval captain. He decided to abandon the ships. To walk away from the Erebus and Terror was suicide. They were the only shelter, the only warmth, the only protection from the polar bears and the wind. But staying meant starving to death in a frozen tomb. Crozier calculated their odds. They were roughly 100 miles from the nearest known outpost of the Hudson's Bay Company. If they could drag boats across the ice to the mainland and then row up the Great Fish River, the Back River, they might find help. It was a desperate, impossible plan, but it was action, and action was better than waiting to die. April 1848, the preparations began. The men, weak from 3 years of confinement and poisoning, had to drag heavy oak whaleboats out of the ships and onto the rough ice. They loaded them with supplies, and here, in the manifest of what they packed, we see the first true signs of madness. A sane man packing for a death march across the Arctic takes food, ammunition, and boots. These men packed silverware. They packed heavy mahogany curtain rods. They packed a backgammon board. They packed books, novels, religious texts that weighed pounds. They packed gold watches. Why? Historians have debated this for a century. Was it the lead poisoning destroying their cognitive functions, making them unable to prioritize? Was it a desperate attempt to hold on to their identity as civilized British sailors? Or was it simply that they couldn't bear to leave these valuable items behind, even if the weight would kill them? On Good Friday, April 21st, 1848, the 105 surviving men climbed down the sides of the Erebus in terror for the last time. They stood on the ice, looking up at the wooden walls that had been their home for 3 years. The ships were ghost ships now, silent and dark. They began to drag the sledges toward King William Island. 3 days into the march, on April 25th, 1848, they reached the site where Lieutenant Gore had left his all-well message the previous year. Crozier ordered the cairn opened. They took out the metal cylinder. They took out the piece of paper that said confidently that everything was fine, and then Fitzjames took a pen and wrote the truth in the margins. This document, known as the Victory Point Note, is the most haunting artifact of the entire expedition. It is the only written voice we have from the end. In the margins of the optimistic form, Fitzjames scribbled a new message in messy, desperate handwriting. April 25th, 1848. HMS Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April, 5 leagues NNW of this, having been beset since 12th of September, 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls, under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier, landed here in latitude 69°37, 42 N long, 98°41 W. And then, the lines that sealed the tragedy. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. And finally the plan: start on tomorrow, 26th, for the Backsfish River. They signed it, Crozier and Fitzjames. They rolled the paper back up, put it back in the cylinder, and buried it in the cairn. It was their last will and testament. They were telling the world, "We are leaving, we are dying, come find us here." Then they turned, their backs on the cairn, and looked south. Ahead of them lay hundreds of miles of broken rock, ice, and nothingness. The men were harnessed to the sledges like pack animals. The boats, laden with useless silver and curtain rods, weighed over 1,000 pounds each. The men were coughing blood. Their gums were bleeding. Their minds were clouded by lead. The march had begun. It was not a march of exploration. It was a funeral procession. The death march of the Franklin expedition is one of the grisliest chapters in human endurance. They weren't walking to safety. They were walking into a meat grinder. Within days, the weaker men began to drop in the traces. They would simply collapse into the snow, unable to take another step. The column would stop. There was no medical aid to give. There was no warm bed to offer. There was only the decision: leave them or carry them. At first, they tried to carry them, but the boats were already too heavy. Soon, the logic of survival took over. Men were left where they fell. Tents were set up as makeshift hospitals that became morgues. As the days turned into weeks, the food ran low. The heavy sledges became immovable anchors. The discipline that Crozier had fought so hard to maintain began to shatter completely. The officers could no longer control the men. The men could no longer control themselves. And out on the grey, windswept gravel of King William Island, facing starvation, the men of the Royal Navy looked at each other. They looked at the dead bodies of their comrades. And a terrible primal thought began to form in their lead-poisoned minds. The tinned food was gone. The salt beef was gone. But there was meat on the ice. The horror was about to reach its final unthinkable stage. The British Empire was about to resort to the most taboo act in human existence. They were about to consume each other. Here is Chapter 5. We are now on the ice with the survivors as the expedition splinters, and the true horror of their condition is revealed. Chapter 5. The March of the Dead. The march south from Victory Point was a masterpiece of futility. To understand why, you have to picture the scene. 105 men, harnessed like mules to heavy wooden sledges. On top of these sledges sat the whaleboats, massive oak-ribbed vessels weighing nearly a ton each, and inside the boats was a junk shop of useless Victorian clutter. They were hauling their world with them. They were dragging the heavy silver cutlery stamped with the family crests of the officers. They were dragging curtain rods, silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, and slippers. In their lead-poisoned minds, These items were essential. They were the totems of their civilization. To leave them behind was to admit that they were no longer Royal Navy officers, but desperate animals. So they kept the silver, and they dropped the food. The pace was agonizing. In the soft, deep snow of King William Island, a team of 20 weak-starving men could barely move a sledge a few miles a day. They would pull for 10 hours, their lungs burning in the freezing air, only to look back and see their camp from the night before still visible on the horizon. It was a treadmill of death. Within the first week, the unity of the group began to fracture. Captain Crozier, the pragmatist, surely saw that the pace was too slow. They had hundreds of miles to go to reach the back river, and they were moving at a crawl. The math didn't work. The food would run out long before they reached the mainland. And then they met the locals. For 3 years, the Franklin expedition had been utterly alone. But they were not the only people in this landscape. The Inuit had lived here for thousands of years. They knew the ice. They knew how to survive. And one day, near the south coast of King William Island, a group of Inuit families encountered the column of ghosts. Decades later, when searchers interviewed the Inuit elders, they told the story of this meeting. It is the only outside perspective we have. They said they saw a group of Kalunaat, white men, pulling a boat. The men were terrifying to look at. Their faces were black with frostbite and dirt. Their eyes were wild and hollow. Their gums were swollen and bleeding from scurvy. They were thin as ravens. The leader of the white men, likely Crozier, tried to communicate. The Inuit called him Agluka, which means strider, or he who takes long steps. Agluka tried to trade. He showed them a knife. He mimed eating. The Inuit, though wary of these sick, unpredictable strangers, gave them some seal meat and blubber. But the encounter was brief. The Inuit saw the madness in the eyes of the sailors. They saw that these men were carrying death. The Inuit slipped away in the night, moving their camp to avoid the bad spirits that seemed to cling to the expedition. They left the white men to their fate. This meeting was a turning point. It was the moment where salvation brushed against them, and then vanished. If Franklin or Crozier had spent the last 2 years learning from the Inuit, instead of hiding inside their ships putting on plays, they might have survived. They might have learned to build igloos, to hunt seal, to wear furs instead of wool. But they hadn't. They were British sailors, too proud to go native, and that pride was now killing them. After the Inuit left, the group split. We know this because of the trail of bodies they left behind. It seems that a decision was made. The sickest men, the ones who could no longer walk, would be sent back to the ships. Maybe the idea was to restock supplies. Maybe it was just to get the dying men off the sledges, so the stronger ones could move faster. But stronger is a relative term. The return party didn't make it far. They collapsed along the trail, one by one. They died in their tracks. Some were found sitting up, frozen in place, looking north toward the ships they would never reach. The main group, led by Crozier, pushed on toward the south, but they were shedding weight in the grisliest way possible. Searchers who retraced this route years later found the evidence of a slow disintegration. They found what they called the place of the boat. It is one of the most haunting archaeological sites in history. It was a lifeboat, mounted on a sledge, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. But it wasn't just abandoned. It was a tomb. Inside the boat were 2 skeletons. One skeleton was tucked into the bow, wrapped in furs. The other was in the stern, surrounded by guns. It looked like a standoff. Had they argued? Had one been guarding the other? Or had they simply been too weak to climb out of the boat and decided to wait for the end together? But it was the contents of the boat that truly revealed the madness. There were 40 pounds of chocolate. There was tea. There was tobacco. There were watches. There were books. The Vicar of Wakefield, a Christian melody book, a Bible. And there were the boots. The men had tried to modify their heavy leather naval boots for the Arctic walking. They had hammered nails into the soles to grip the ice. They had sewn canvas strips around the ankles, but the boots were falling apart. They were stiff, frozen, and brutal on their feet. The skeletons in the boat had their feet wrapped in rags. The place of the boat tells us that by this point, the chain of command had evaporated. You don't haul 40 pounds of chocolate and leave behind your rifle unless your mind is broken. You don't carry silver spoons while you are starving unless you have lost your grip on reality. As May turned to June, the weather should have improved, but on King William Island, spring is a cruel joke. The snow turned to slush. The men were now wading through freezing water up to their knees. Their boots rotted. Their feet turned black, with trench foot and frostbite. And the hunger became a living thing. The seal meat from the Inuit was long gone. The birds hadn't returned yet. The chocolate was finished. The men began to look at the leather of their boots, just like Franklin had done 30 years before. They boiled the leather straps. They chewed on the canvas. But leather provides no nutrition. It just fills the belly while the body eats itself. The group began to fragment into smaller and smaller bands. The discipline of the column was gone. It was now every man for himself, or every small clique for itself. Some men simply refused to take another step. They sat down on the rocks, pulled their blankets over their heads, and waited for the cold to take them. Others, driven by a primal will to survive, kept walking. They were heading for a place called Starvation Cove. It was in these final weeks, as the last vestiges of civilization stripped away, that the unthinkable happened. We don't know who started it. We don't know if it was sanctioned by the officers or if it was a mutiny of the starving. But we know it happened. The forensic evidence is irrefutable. When modern scientists examined the bones found along this trail, they found cut marks. These weren't animal gnaw marks. These were clean, parallel slices made by steel knives. They were found on the femurs, the thigh bones, where the meat is thickest. They were found on the skulls. The men of the Franklin expedition, the pride of the Royal Navy, the Christians who carried Bibles in their pockets, had begun to butcher the dead. It didn't start as murder. It likely started as scavenging. A man died of scurvy or exposure, and his messmates, insane with hunger, made the horrific choice to use his body to keep the rest of them alive for one more day. But once that line is crossed, there is no going back. The taboo is broken. The civilized world is gone. There is only the ice, the hunger, and the meat. As the scattered survivors stumbled toward the mainland, leaving a trail of butchered bones behind them, they were no longer explorers. They were monsters in their own eyes. The lead poisoning had taken their minds. The scurvy had taken their bodies. And now, the hunger had taken their souls. The tragedy wasn't just that they died. It was how they died. They didn't die as heroes. They died in a state of absolute abject horror, stripping the flesh from their friends in a desperate, doomed attempt to walk out of the white hell. And the worst part? They were almost there. The mainland was visible. The river was just ahead. But for most of them, the journey ended here, in the blood-stained snow of King William Island. Chapter 6. The Last Stand. By the time the remaining men reached the southern tip of King William Island, the expedition had ceased to be a naval unit. It was now just a scattering of dying men stumbling through a wasteland. The main group, or what was left of it, had managed to drag one of the heavy boats all the way to a place that history would grimly christen Starvation Cove. It was here, just a few miles from the open water that would have led them to the mainland river, that the final act played out. It is difficult to reconstruct the exact timeline of the end because there were no survivors to tell it, but the bones tell the story. At Starvation Cove, modern searchers found the remains of roughly 30 to 40 men. This was likely the last consolidated group, the rear guard, led by the surviving officers, perhaps even Crozier himself, though his body was never identified. They had reached the limit of their endurance. The terrain here is unforgiving, sharp limestone shingle that shreds boots and freezes wet feet instantly. They were likely carrying the sick, or perhaps the sick were simply crawling behind them. At this spot, the discipline finally vanished completely. It wasn't a mutiny in the traditional sense, it was a collapse of will. The men simply stopped. They couldn't pull the boat another inch. They couldn't lift their legs. They collapsed in. The snow huddled together for warmth in the lee of a low ridge. The evidence found at Starvation Cove is the most disturbing of all. It wasn't just the cut marks on the bones that indicated cannibalism, it was the sheer chaos of the scene. The items scattered around the bodies were a testament to their delirium. There were gold watches, silver forks, and even a pair of spectacles, items that were utterly useless for survival, but had been carried for hundreds of miles. It suggests that in their final hours, the men were clinging to these objects as their last tether to reality. A silver spoon wasn't just a spoon, it was a memory of a dinner table in London. A gold watch wasn't just a timekeeper, it was a promise that time still mattered. But here, at the edge of the world, time had run out. The forensic analysis of the bones at Starvation Cove paints a picture of extreme suffering. The men were suffering from advanced scurvy, meaning their old wounds had reopened and their bones were brittle. They had severe lead poisoning, which would have caused lead madness, hallucinations, paranoia, and cognitive failure. They were starving, dehydrated, and hypothermic. As they lay dying, the weather likely turned. A blizzard, common even in the Arctic summer, would have buried them. One by one, the lights went out. The man who held the line, the officer who tried to keep order, the boy who cried for his mother, they all faded into the white noise of the storm. But not everyone died at Starvation Cove. Inuit oral history tells us that a few men, perhaps 3 or 4, kept walking. They managed to cross the ice bridge to the mainland. They reached the mouth of the Back River. They had made it. They had reached the goal. But they were too late. The Inuit hunters who found them later described finding a tent pitched near the river. Inside were bodies. One man was sitting up, holding a gun, frozen in a final posture of defense. Nearby, there were bones that had been cracked open to extract the marrow. These final few, the toughest of the tough, had walked 400 miles on rotting feet, dragging a ton of oak and iron, only to die within sight of the river that could have saved them. They starved to death in a land that was teeming with life, if only they had known how to catch it. Back on the ice, the silence returned. The snow covered the bodies at Starvation Cove. It covered the skeletons in the boat. It covered the all-well cairn. The Arctic reclaimed its prize. For the next few years, the world knew nothing. In London, Lady Jane Franklin was still organising search parties, convinced her husband was alive. She poured her fortune into outfitting ships. She shamed the Admiralty into sending rescue fleets. But the Arctic is vast. The searchers looked in the wrong places. They looked north, assuming Franklin had found the open sea. They looked west. They didn't look south, into the cul-de-sac of King William Island. It wasn't until 1854, 6 years after the abandonment, that the truth began to trickle out. And it didn't come from a British ship. It came from a man who knew how to listen. Dr. John Ray was a different kind of explorer. He worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. He didn't sail massive ships. He walked on snowshoes. He didn't eat tinned food. He hunted caribou. He respected the Inuit and learned their language. While surveying the Boothia Peninsula, Ray met an Inuk hunter named Inuk Puje Juk. The hunter told him a story about a group of white men who had starved to death years earlier to the west. He said the men had dragged boats and had fallen down and died as they walked, but then the hunter produced something that stopped Ray's heart. He pulled out a silver fork, and a silver spoon, and a medal. Ray took the items. He looked at the crest stamped into the silver. One bore the crest of Sir John Franklin. Another had the crest of Captain Crozier. Another belonged to Lieutenant Gore. This was it, the smoking gun, the proof that the expedition was destroyed. But the hunter had one more detail to add. He told Ray that many of the bodies had been found in a state that suggested the men had eaten each other. From the mutilated state of many of the corpses and the contents of the kettles, Ray wrote in his report, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last resource, cannibalism. Ray hurried back to England with this news. He expected to be hailed as a hero for solving the great mystery. Instead, he was vilified. Victorian England could accept that Franklin had died. They could accept that he had frozen or starved, but they could not accept that British Royal Navy officers, gentlemen, Christians, heroes, had eaten each other. It was impossible. It was a slander. The establishment turned on Ray, and leading the charge was none other than the most famous writer in the world, Charles Dickens. Dickens wrote scathing articles in his magazine, Household Words. He attacked the Inuit testimony, calling them treacherous savages and covetous, treacherous and cruel. He argued that it was much more likely that the Inuit had murdered the weakened sailors and then invented the cannibalism story to cover their crimes. He wrote that the wildest and most improbable theory was preferable to the idea that British gentlemen had lost their civility. The Empire closed ranks. They accepted that Franklin was dead, but they rejected the manner of his death. They built statues of him. They wrote poems about his heroism. They carved Discoverer of the Northwest Passage on his monument, even though he had failed to navigate it. They buried the truth of the cannibalism, the lead poisoning, and the madness under a layer of marble and myth. They wanted a hero, not a horror story. But the bones on King William Island didn't care about Victorian sensibilities. They lay there, bleaching in the midnight sun, holding the truth in their cut marks and their lead-laced marrow. They waited for the snow to melt, and for a new generation of scientists to come and ask the questions that Charles Dickens was too afraid to ask. The mystery was solved in 1854, but it wasn't finished. The ships were still missing, the grave of Franklin was still missing, and the full story of those final terrifying days was still locked in the ice, waiting for the future to thaw it out. Chapter 7. The Widow's Crusade. When Dr. John Ray returned to London in 1854 with the first hard evidence of the disaster, the silver forks, the medals, and the Inuit stories of cannibalism, he expected the nation to mourn. He expected them to face the hard truth of what had happened on the ice. Instead, the Empire recoiled. The report that the men of the Royal Navy had resorted to the last resource was too horrific to be believed. It shattered the Victorian self-image. British officers were stoic, Christian, and civilized. They did not eat each other. To suggest otherwise was considered a slur against the dead. Leading the charge against the truth was Lady Jane Franklin. We cannot tell this story without talking about Jane Franklin. She is one of the most formidable figures of the 19th century. When her husband failed to return in 1848, she didn't put on widow's weeds and retire to a parlour. She went to war with the Admiralty. She wrote letters to the Tsar of Russia and the President of the United States, begging for help. She spent her entire fortune outfitting private rescue expeditions. She made the search for John Franklin the most famous cause in the world, but she wanted a specific kind of ending. She wanted a hero's ending. She wanted to find him alive, or at least find proof that he had died nobly, clutching a Bible and the Union Jack. She absolutely refused to accept John Ray's story of starvation and cannibalism. So she commissioned one final ship. She bought a steam yacht called the Fox and hired Captain Francis McClintock to go back to the Arctic. His orders were clear: find the ships, find the records, and clear her husband's name. McClintock sailed in 1857. He was a different breed of explorer. He was tough, methodical, and he knew how to sledge. He didn't just sail, he got out on the ice and walked. In the spring of 1859, McClintock's sledging parties reached King William Island. They were now walking on the very ground where the Franklin crew had died 11 years earlier. The snow had covered much of the horror, but the land does not forget. On May 25th, 1859, McClintock's men were walking along a gravel ridge on the western coast when they saw something sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, the shape resolved into a nightmare. It was a skeleton. The man was lying on his face. He was still wearing his uniform, a steward's blue jacket with brass buttons and a black silk neckerchief. He had fallen while walking and simply never got up. The frost had preserved shreds of his clothing and his hair. Near him lay a clothes brush and a pocket comb. This was the first physical contact with the dead. It was a visceral shock. This wasn't a rumour from an Inuit hunter. This was a British sailor lying where he fell, frozen in time. But the true horror was waiting further down the coast. A few days later, McClintock found the place of the boat. We mentioned this in the previous chapters, but we must look at it now through the eyes of the men who found it. To McClintock, This boat was a scene of incomprehensible madness. The boat was massive, 28 feet long and 7 feet wide. It was mounted on a heavy sledge that alone weighed nearly half a ton. It was pointing north, back toward the ships, not south towards safety. This suggested that the men had given up the march and were trying to return to the Erebus and Terror when they died. Inside the boat were the two skeletons. One was huddled in the bow, the other in the stern. But it was the cargo that baffled McClintock. He catalogued it with meticulous, confused detail in his journal. He listed 5 watches, 2 double-barreled guns, a large amount of printed books, slippers, silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, sponges, toothbrushes, hair combs. He found nearly 40 pounds of chocolate, still edible after 11 years. He found tea, but he found no biscuits and no meat. McClintock wrote, "A mere accumulation of dead weight of little use, and very likely to break down the strength of the sledge crews." He was looking at the aftermath of lead poisoning, though he didn't know it. He was looking at men who had chosen to haul silver plate instead of food. He was looking at a complete cognitive collapse. But the most important discovery happened nearby, at Victory Point. One of McClintock's lieutenants, William Hobson, found a stone cairn. Around it were scattered tins, cans, and equipment. The cairn had been torn down, likely by animals or weather, but inside the rubble was a rusted tin cylinder. Hobson pried it open. Inside was a single sheet of Admiralty paper, stained with rust and damp. It was the Victory Point note. When Hobson read it, his hands must have shaken. He saw the first message, "All well," from 1847. And then he saw the scrawled margin note from 1848. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June 1847. HMS Terror and Erebus were deserted. Start on tomorrow, 26th, for the Backsfish River. This was it, the Holy Grail. It gave the date of death. It gave the location of the abandonment. It confirmed that the ships were lost. McClintock brought these relics back to England in 1859. The arrival of the Fox was a national sensation. The Victory Point note was printed in every newspaper. The relics, the watches, the spoons, the buttons were put on display. Lady Franklin had her answer. Her husband had died before the abandonment. He had died aboard his ship, presumably a hero. He hadn't been part of the death march. He hadn't been part of the cannibalism. She seized on this narrative. She spun the story masterfully. Sir John Franklin was the man who forged the Northwest Passage with his life. The fact that he never actually sailed through it didn't matter. The fact that his men had eaten each other was swept under the rug. The statue was built in Waterloo Place in London with the inscription, "To the great navigator and his brave companions." The Empire sighed in relief. They had closure. The mystery was solved, but it wasn't. McClintock had found the note and a few bodies, but he hadn't found the ships. He hadn't found the grave of Franklin. He hadn't explained why they died. Why did 129 men, equipped with the best technology in the world, succumb so completely? Why did they haul curtain rods? Why did they leave the ships when they still had food? And crucially, he hadn't found the rest of the men. He found 30 or 40 sets of remains. Where were the other 100? After 1859, the Arctic silence returned. The Erebus and Terror sat on the bottom of the ocean, gathering silt. The bodies of the crew, scattered across King William Island, sank into the moss. For nearly 120 years, the story became a legend. It was a ghost story told to frighten young sailors. It was a cautionary tale about hubris. But scientifically, it was a cold case. It wasn't until the 1980s that the silence was broken again. And this time, it wasn't explorers who came looking. It was forensic anthropologists. They didn't come to find the Northwest Passage. They came to find the bodies. They came with scalpels, X-ray machines, and hazmat suits. They wanted to know what really killed the Franklin expedition, and what they found would vindicate Dr. John Ray and rewrite history. They would drag the dark secret of the lead and the knife back into the light. The Victorian cover-up was about to crack. Chapter 8. The Blue Man. For nearly 130 years, the Franklin expedition was a ghost story. It was a legend of heroism and tragedy, but it lacked a smoking gun. Historians argued over maps, they argued over routes, they argued over who was to blame, but nobody had gone back to ask the dead themselves. That changed in 1984. Dr. Owen Beatty, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Alberta, had a different theory. He wasn't interested in the ships. He wasn't interested in the Northwest Passage. He was interested in the why. Why did a crew of 129 healthy men, equipped with the best technology of the Victorian age, collapse so completely? Why did they die so fast? Why did they act so irrationally at the end? Beatty suspected that the answer wasn't in the ice, but in the bodies. He focused his attention on Beechey Island. This was the site of the first winter camp, where the three young sailors, John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain, had died in early 1846. Their graves were still there, marked by the wooden headboards, untouched for over a century. Beatty's plan was audacious. He wanted to exhume the bodies. He wanted to perform the autopsies that the ship's surgeons should have performed in 1846. In August 1984, Beatty and his team arrived on the bleak gravel beach of Beechey Island. The landscape hadn't changed since Franklin's men stood there. It was a flat, grey wasteland of limestone shingle, swept by freezing winds. They started with the Oitsilium grave of John Torrington. Digging in the Arctic is a brutal process. The ground is permafrost, frozen solid as concrete. You can't just shovel it out. Beatty's team had to use pickaxes and warm water to slowly thaw the earth, inch by inch. It took days to reach the coffin. When they finally cleared the gravel, they found a simple wooden box. It was covered in blue wool cloth, a sign of the care his shipmates had taken. The wood was perfectly preserved. The cold had stopped time. Beatty unscrewed the lid. He lifted the wood, and what he saw underneath became one of the most famous and haunting images in the history of exploration. John Torrington was looking back at him. Torrington wasn't a skeleton. He was a mummy. The permafrost had frozen him so quickly and so completely that he was perfectly preserved. He looked like he had died yesterday. His skin was pale. His eyes were open, staring up at the Arctic sky with a milky blue gaze. His teeth were visible. He was wearing a grey cotton shirt with buttons. His hands were bound at his sides. It was a face that had been waiting in the dark for 138 years. The team worked quickly. They couldn't keep him exposed for long. They lifted the body, which was light, frozen stiff, and weighed less than 90 pounds, and performed a detailed examination. This wasn't just a grim curiosity. It was a crime scene investigation. Beatty took tissue samples. He took hair samples. He took bone fragments. He wanted to know the chemical composition of John Torrington. The autopsy revealed that Torrington had indeed been sick. His lungs were black with carbon deposits, likely from the coal smoke and oil lamps inside the ship. He had advanced pneumonia. He had signs of tuberculosis. He was a very sick young man. But lots of people in 1846 had tuberculosis. It didn't explain why the entire expedition fell apart. Beatty took the hair samples back to the lab in Alberta. He subjected them to atomic absorption analysis. He was looking for heavy metals. He was looking for poison. When the results came back, the graph spiked off the charts. John Torrington's hair contained lead levels of more than 600 parts per million. To put that in perspective, a normal level for a modern human is about 5. Anything over 10 is considered concerning. Anything over 30 is toxic. Torrington was walking around with 600. He was a toxic waste dump. This changed everything. This wasn't just bad luck or bad weather. This was mass poisoning. Beatty realized that if Torrington, who died in the first year, had levels this high, the men who survived for 3 or 4 years must have been absolutely saturated with lead. But where did it come from? Beatty returned to Beechey Island in 1986 to exhume the other 2 bodies, John Hartnell and William Brain. The results were the same, high lead, but while he was there, he started looking at the trash. The Franklin expedition had left behind a massive garbage pile on Beechey Island. Among the debris were hundreds of rusted tin cans. These were the revolutionary tinned provisions from Stephen Goldner's factory. Beatty collected the cans and analysed them. What he found was shocking. The cans were constructed using a canister method that involved soldering the lid shut with lead solder. But the soldering was sloppy. It was thick, lumpy, and careless. On the inside of the cans, Beatty found beads of lead solder that had dripped down like candle wax. These beads would have mixed with the soup, the gravy, and the meat. The chemistry of the food made it worse. The acidity of the food broke down the lead, dissolving it into the liquid. Every time the men ate a bowl of soup, they were drinking a cocktail of neurotoxins. Beatty had found the smoking gun. The miracle technology that was supposed to save them had actually killed them. This discovery rewrote the narrative of the Franklin expedition. It explained the madness. Lead poisoning attacks the central nervous system. It causes paranoia, aggression, confusion, and lethargy. It explains why the officers couldn't make rational decisions. It explains why they hauled curtain rods across the ice. It explains why they left the ships when they should have stayed. Their brains were literally rotting. The exhumations on Beachy Island were respectful. After the examinations, Beatty and his team placed the bodies back in their coffins. They reburied them in the permafrost, piling the stones back exactly as they had found them. They left John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Braine to their rest. But they brought back the truth. The Franklin expedition wasn't defeated by the cold. It wasn't defeated by the starvation, at least not at first. It was defeated by a government contract. It was defeated by the lowest bidder who made cheap cans. The Blue Man had spoken. The mystery of the why was solved, but the mystery of the where remained. The ships, the Erebus and Terror, were still missing, and until they were found, the story had no ending. For another 30 years, the Arctic kept the ships hidden, but technology was catching up. The search was about to move from the land to the bottom of the sea. For over a century, the search for the Franklin expedition was a British affair. It was conducted by white men, looking for white men, using white men's maps. They largely ignored the only people who actually lived there. The Inuit knew where the ships were. They had known for generations, but nobody listened. In the Victorian era, the testimony of the Inuit was dismissed as folklore, or the ramblings of savages, as Dickens put it. But as the modern search intensified in the 21st century, a new generation of searchers realized that the key to unlocking the mystery wasn't sonar technology, it was oral history. Louis Kamukak was an Inuit historian from Joahaven, a small hamlet on King William Island. He spent his life collecting the stories of his elders. He sat in kitchens and community centers, listening to the old grandmothers and grandfathers recount the stories passed down from their ancestors. The stories were incredibly specific. They didn't just say, "ship sank." They gave details. One story spoke of a ship that was crushed by the ice off the northwest coast of King William Island. This matched the location of the abandonment, but another story spoke of a ship that drifted south. This was the controversial part. The British history books said both ships were abandoned in 1848 and likely crushed, but the Inuit elders insisted that one ship survived the crushing. They said it drifted down into Queen Maud Gulf. They called it the ship that sank. They told stories of entering the ship. They described dark rooms and many dead bodies inside. They described finding tools and wood. One specific story, passed down through the generations, described a ship that sank in shallow water near an island called O'Reilly Island. The Inuit hunters saw the mast sticking out of the water. For years, Parks Canada, the government agency in charge of the search, had focused their grid much further north, where the Victory Point note said the ships were abandoned. They spent millions of dollars towing sonar sleds back and forth across the Victoria Strait, finding nothing but rocks and silence. But in 2014, they decided to shift the search. They decided to trust Louis Kamukak. They decided to trust the folklore. They moved the search area south into the Queen Maud Gulf, near the area the Inuit called Umiaktalik, the place of the boat. In September 2014, the search team was battling bad weather. The ice was moving in. They had only a few days left in the season. The main search ship, the CCGS Sir Wilfrid Laurier, was forced to take a detour to avoid ice. They ended up in a shallow area near an islet called Hat Island. It was a lucky detour, or maybe it was fate. While scanning the seabed in this shallow, uncharted water, the helicopter pilot spotted something on the beach of a nearby island. It was a piece of iron. They sent a team ashore. It was a davit, a heavy iron crane used to lower a boat. It had the markings of the Royal Navy. This was the clue they needed. If a davit was here, the ship had to be close. They deployed their underwater sonar vehicle. On September 7th, 2014, the sonar screen on the research boat lit up. Typically, the seafloor is boring. It's mud and rock. But on the screen, a massive, blocky shape appeared. It had straight lines. It had height. It was man-made. As the image sharpened, the crew on the boat gasped. There, sitting upright on the bottom of the ocean in just 36 feet of water, was a shipwreck. It was mostly intact. The hull was sound. The deck planking was there. And near the stern, they could clearly see the space where a screw propeller, the new technology Franklin was so proud of, would have been. They had
found himself telling her everything, not just about Emma, but about Lily, about Margaret, about the guilt that had eaten at him for 5 years. I was so certain it was just a childhood illness, he said, staring into his coffee cup. I was the doctor. I was supposed to know, but I missed it. And by the time I realized how sick she was, Elizabeth closed the passes. Claire listened without interrupting, her dark eyes holding his. She asked me to fix it. In the end, she said, Papa, fix it. You fixed everyone. His voice broke, and I couldn't fix my own daughter. You couldn't fix what Wade had already broken. Claire's voice was gentle, but firm. The water was poisoned before you ever knew to look for it. You're a doctor, not a miracle worker. I should have. You should have had information that Wade deliberately concealed. She leaned forward, intensely sharpening her features. That's why we're doing this. That's why we get those documents. So no other father has to sit where you're sitting, blaming himself for something he couldn't possibly have known. Caleb looked at her. This fierce young woman who had stumbled into his life through a blizzard, carrying secrets that could change everything. You sound like your mother, he said quietly. I'll take that as a compliment. It is. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared grief creating an unexpected bond. You should rest, Claire said finally. You've been up all night. So should you. I slept. You didn't. She rose, gathering the dishes. We'll plan tomorrow. The town meeting is in 3 days. That's when we need to act. The town meeting? Wade calls one every January. Discusses mine business, town improvements, that sort of thing. A hard smile crossed her face. Everyone attends, including Wade, which means his house will be empty. Caleb understood immediately. That's when we get the documents. That's when we get justice. Claire paused at the kitchen doorway. Sleep, Caleb. You've earned it. He did sleep, deeper than he had in months. And when he woke in the late afternoon, the ghost of Lily's voice seemed quieter somehow. Not gone, never gone, but no longer screaming. The days before the town meeting passed quickly, filled with preparation. Claire drew detailed maps of the Wade mansion, marking every entrance, every patrol route, every squeaky floorboard. Caleb reviewed his research, organizing 5 years of evidence into a coherent case. Walter quietly spread word among trusted neighbors, feeling out who might stand with them when the time came. On the second day, an unexpected visitor arrived. Claire was in the kitchen when the knock came. Her hand flew to the pistol. Caleb had given her Margaret's pistol. But Walter's voice carried from the front hall. It's all right, miss. He's a friend. She emerged cautiously to find an elderly Native American man standing in the entrance hall. His copper face was deeply.
The shipwreck find. It was a time travel event. When the remote-operated vehicle, the ROV, descended into the black freezing water of Terror Bay, the operators expected to see a wreck. They expected to see smashed timbers, scattered debris, and the chaos of a ship that had been crushed by ice. Instead, they found a ship that looked like it was waiting for inspection. The Terror is sitting upright on the keel. The freezing water and the lack of sunlight have acted as a perfect preservative. There are no wood-boring worms in the Arctic, so the timber hasn't rotted. The ship looks almost exactly as it did the day Francis Crozier walked off it in 1848. The ROV glided over the deck. The ship's wheel was still there, standing tall. The davits, the cranes for the boats, were swung out, confirming that the boats had been deployed. But it was when the camera looked through the glass windows of the stern gallery that the true haunting began. Glass is fragile. Ice crushes steel. And yet, the windows of the captain's cabin were intact. The camera peered through the grime of 170 years. Inside, the beam of light illuminated a scene of eerie domesticity. It wasn't a ruin, it was a room. Tables were still standing. Chairs were in place. On the shelves, plates and bowls were stacked neatly. In the pantry, bottles of wine and ale were still corked, the liquid inside likely still drinkable after nearly 2 centuries. A rifle was leaning against the wall, ready to be picked up. It was a ghost ship in the truest sense. It looked as if the crew had simply stepped out for a cigarette and never came back. This level of preservation changes everything. It means that the Terror is not just a hull, it is a sealed archive. And the most valuable thing inside isn't the gold or the silver, it's the paper. Paper, surprisingly, survives very well underwater if it is cold and dark enough. We know that Franklin and Crozier kept detailed logs. They wrote journals. They drew maps. They recorded magnetic data. And crucially, they would have written down exactly what went wrong. In the Victorian Navy, these documents were considered sacred. You didn't just leave them on a table. You sealed them in wax, and placed them in waterproof canisters, or you locked them in the drawers of the captain's desk. The ROV footage shows a large desk in Crozier's cabin. The drawers are closed. Think about that. Inside that desk, right now, sitting at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, could be the diary of Francis Crozier. It could contain the day-by-day account of the lead poisoning, the madness, the death of Franklin, and the decision to abandon ship. It could confirm the date of the first case of cannibalism. It could name the men who mutinied. It is the holy grail of maritime history, sitting just a few inches of wood away from us, but the Terror offers more than just papers. It offers a forensic snapshot of the final days on board. The fact that the ship was found so far south and so neatly put to bed contradicts the Victory Point note. Remember, the note said the ships were abandoned in the pack ice to the north, but here lies the Terror, miles away in a sheltered bay, anchor deployed. This suggests a re-manning theory. It implies that after the death march began, a group of men realized they were walking to their deaths. They turned around, they went back to the ships, they managed to break the Terror out of the ice and sail her south, hoping to find a different way out. Imagine the horror of that return journey. You are starving. You have watched your friends die on the ice. You drag yourself back to the frozen dark ship. You fire up the boiler one last time. You sail into Terror Bay, and then the winter catches you again. The ice closes in. You drop the anchor, and you realize, this is it. We aren't getting out. The interior of the ship likely holds the bodies of these final survivors. Unlike the bones on King William Island, which were scattered by foxes and weather, the bodies inside the ship will be perfectly preserved. They will be found in their hammocks. They will be found sitting at the mess tables. We will be able to see their faces. We will be able to test their hair for lead, their bones for scurvy, and their stomachs for what their last meal was. Did they resort to cannibalism inside the ship? The answer is waiting in the dark. The Canadian government has been slow to excavate the interior, and for good reason. The site is technically a grave. It belongs to the British Navy, and it is under the stewardship of the Inuit Heritage Trust. They treat it with the reverence of a cemetery. But the excavation has begun. Divers have started to recover artifacts from the Erebus. They have brought up a hairbrush with strands of human hair still in the bristles. They have brought up a lieutenant's epaulette, the gold fringe of his uniform. They have brought up a ceramic jar of mustard. Every item tells a story of the life that was lived before the horror. The mustard jar speaks of roast beef dinners. The hairbrush speaks of the morning routine. The epaulette speaks of the pride of rank. But the Terror remains the prize. It is the deeper wreck, the colder wreck, and the more intact wreck. It is the sealed tomb. When the archaeologists finally open those desk drawers, and they will, we might finally hear the voice of Francis Crozier speaking from the grave. We might finally read the last entry, written by a hand shaking with cold and lead poisoning, telling us exactly how the lights went out. The ship is a time capsule, locked tight in 1848, waiting to spill its secrets. And when it does, it might reveal a truth even darker than the one we know. Chapter 11. The Toxicology of Despair. We have talked about the lead. We have talked about the scurvy. But to truly understand the final days of the Franklin expedition, we have to look at the perfect storm that was raging inside the bodies of these men. In recent years, a new wave of scientific analysis has complicated the lead poisoning theory. While it is true that the men had astronomical levels of lead in their systems, enough to cause madness, modern toxicologists argue that lead alone didn't kill them. It was the combination. It was a chemical cascade of failure. New studies on the fingernail samples of the crew, recovered from the mummies, show a terrifying lack of zinc. Zinc is crucial for the immune system. Without it, you cannot fight off infection. The men were suffering from severe zinc deficiency, likely caused by their diet of salted meat and tinned slop. So, picture the biological reality of a sailor in 1848. His gums are rotting from scurvy, meaning he cannot chew the hardtack biscuits. His immune system has collapsed from zinc deficiency, meaning a common cold could kill him. His lungs are filled with coal dust and tuberculosis bacteria, and his brain is swimming in a toxic bath of lead, stripping away his ability to think, to reason, and to feel hope. He is a walking corpse long before he falls into the snow. This toxicology of despair explains the baffling behavior we see at the end. It explains why they dragged the heavy boats. It explains why they walked away from the food. But the most chilling evidence comes from the bones, found at the very end of the trail, at a site called the Boat Place on the Adelaide Peninsula. Here, the forensic evidence of cannibalism is not just suggested, it is industrial. When anthropologists examined the bone fragments under high magnification microscopes, they found pot polishing. This is a specific type of abrasion that occurs when bone ends rub against the inside of a metal pot while boiling. This tells us something profound and horrific. The survivors weren't just eating the flesh of the dead in a raw, animalistic frenzy. They were cooking it. They were gathering around a fire, melting snow in a kettle, and boiling the bones of their messmates to extract the grease and marrow. It suggests a terrifying calmness, a routine. Even at the very end, in the depths of their madness and starvation, they were still British sailors. They were still preparing a meal, even if the meal was an abomination. There is evidence that they targeted the long bones, the femurs and tibias, cracking them open with rocks to get to the marrow, which is high in fat. In the Arctic, fat is life. The brain craves it. The starving body demands it. We also have to consider the last man theory. Based on the distribution of the bodies, it is likely that the group dwindled down to a final handful of survivors, perhaps 3 or 4 men. These men would have been the strongest, or perhaps the most ruthless. They would have watched the others die. They would have harvested the bodies. Imagine being the last man standing. The silence of the Arctic is absolute. The wind is the only sound. You are surrounded by the picked clean bones of your friends. You are holding a loaded shotgun, which was found at the site. You are waiting. What goes through the mind of the last survivor of the Franklin expedition? Does he think about the glory of the Empire? Does he think about the Northwest Passage? Or does he just think about the warmth of a fire he will never feel again? The tragedy of Chapter 11 is the tragedy of the human animal. Strip away the uniforms, the ranks, the Bibles, and the technology, and we are just biology. And when the biology fails, when the chemistry turns against us, we revert to something ancient and terrifying. The Franklin expedition didn't end with a bang. It ended with the scraping of a knife against a bone in the twilight of the Arctic summer. Chapter 12. The Ghosts of Gjoa. Haven. Today, the Arctic is changing. The ice that trapped Franklin is melting. The Northwest Passage, the deadly maze that killed 129 men, is now becoming a shipping lane for cruise ships and tankers. The White Void is open for business, but the ghosts remain. The wrecks of the Erebus and Terror are now protected National Historic Sites. They are jointly managed by the Canadian government and the Inuit Heritage Trust. This partnership is the final irony of the story. The people who were ignored, whose testimony was dismissed as folklore, are now the guardians of the ships. In the hamlet of Gjoa-Haven, the closest community to the wreck sites, the memory of the expedition is still alive. The locals still tell the stories of Agluka, Crozier, and the starving men. But now they also welcome the scientists. The discovery of the ships has not closed the book. It has opened a library. Every summer, divers go down. Every summer, they bring up new pieces of the puzzle. They have recovered the ship's bell of the Erebus, stamped with the date 1845. When they brought it to the surface and cleaned it, they rang it. The sound rang out clear and true across the water, a sound that hadn't been heard since the crew was alive. It was a voice from the grave. They have recovered sealing wax, ceramic plates, and leather boots. They are currently working on excavating the officers' cabins. But the biggest mystery remains. Where is Sir John Franklin? His grave has never been found. The Victory Point note said he died in June 1847, while the ships were still beset. It is highly likely that he was buried in the ice, or perhaps placed in a barrel of rum and stored in the hold to be taken back to England, a common practice for high-ranking officers. If he was buried in the ice, his body is gone, lost to the drift and the melt. But if he is on the ship, if he is in the hold of the Erebus, then he is still there, waiting. The finding of Franklin's body would be the final period at the end of the sentence. It would bring the commander home. But perhaps it is better if we never find him. Perhaps it is better if he remains part of the ice. The story of the Franklin expedition is not just a story about a failed voyage. It is a story about hubris. It is a story about the arrogance of thinking we can conquer nature with machines. We marched into the ice with steam engines and tinned food, thinking we were masters of the world, and the ice showed us, with brutal efficiency, that we are nothing. The 129 men of the Erebus and Terror are not just historical figures. They are mirrors. They show us what happens when our technology fails and our ambition outstrips our ability. They remind us that the world is wild and it does not care about our maps. They vanished in the ice. They died in the dark. But through the work of historians, the stories of the Inuit, and the science of the modern age, they have finally returned. The ships are found. The mystery is solved. But the horror of those final days will echo in the Arctic wind forever. And that, my friends, is the true terrifying fate of the Franklin expedition. A story of ambition, poison, madness, and the ultimate price of pride. It's hard to imagine what those final moments were like, standing on the edge of the known world, realizing that no help was coming, and that the only thing left to eat was each other. I want to know what you think. Do you believe the last man theory? Do you think they sailed the Terror south in a last-ditch attempt to escape? Or was it doomed from the moment they ate that first tin of poisoned food? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark corners of history, please do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to Eclipsed Histories, and ring the bell so you never miss a descent into the unknown. I'll see you in the next one. Stay warm.